There is a plant that grows in ditches, along roadsides, in forgotten corners of North America. For 2,500 years, its milky sap relieved pain when nothing else could. Surgeons carried it into Civil War field hospitals when morphine supplies ran dry. Polish doctors prescribed it when opium killed more patients than it saved. Pharmacists sold it in every drugstore across America until 1944. Then it vanished. Not because it failed, because it succeeded without profit. A painkiller you cannot patent. A sedative that grows without permission. Medicine that asks for no prescription, no refill, no recurring revenue. The pharmaceutical industry built an $80 billion empire on synthetic pain relief. And this plant, which relieved suffering for millennia, was buried beneath it. This is wild lettuce, the painkiller they erased. Welcome to nature's lost vault. The archive opens in ancient Egypt, 1550 BCE. Inside the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever discovered, scribes recorded a plant they called lettuce of the gods. Its milky sap drove away pain and brought sleep. Greek physician Dioscorides documented it in 77 CE. He called it Lactuca virosa, the bitter lettuce. The name itself reveals its secret. Lactuca comes from the Latin for milk. Virosa means potent. When you cut the stem, white sap bleeds out like tears from a wound. This is lactucarium. When dried, it hardens into a brown resin that looks very much like crude opium. Ancient physicians called it lettuce opium because of what it could do. It could relieve pain, calm coughs, and bring sleep. All without the chains of addiction. The plant itself stands defiant, 6 feet tall, crowned with small yellow flowers. Green stems are sometimes spotted purple. Leaves are jagged with spines running down the central vein. Every part contains the medicine, but the sap holds the power. Romans used it to treat everything from insomnia to battlefield wounds. For centuries it was simply understood. Pain existed, and this plant, growing wild across Europe and Asia, answered it. By 1799, lactucarium reached the United States. Doctors prescribed it. Pharmacists sold it in tinctures and lozenges. It sat on shelves beside laudanum and morphine as one more tool against suffering. Then, in 1861, everything changed. The American Civil War erupted. Within months, Union Army medical supplies faced catastrophe. The Union alone issued nearly 10 million opium pills to its soldiers, plus 2.8 million ounces of opium powders and tinctures. But Confederate forces had almost none. The Union blockade strangled Southern supply lines. By 1862, Confederate field hospitals ran out of morphine entirely. Surgeons amputated limbs without anesthesia. Soldiers died screaming. Desperate doctors turned to what grew free. Wild lettuce thrived across roadsides and riverbanks throughout the South. Confederate surgeons harvested it themselves, cutting stems, collecting the milky sap, and drying it into a brown resin. It worked. Not as powerful as morphine, but it dulled the unbearable. It allowed surgeries. It gave dying men enough peace to close their eyes. Medical staff documented it in field reports. When liquid opium became scarce, lactucarium provided essential relief. One Confederate surgeon wrote that wild lettuce kept more soldiers alive than any other substitute remedy they found. The North watched. When the war ended in 1865, American doctors had learned something critical. Opium addiction was destroying thousands of veterans. The hypodermic needle was introduced in 1856 and used widely by the 1870s, and it had created an epidemic. By 1895, 1 in every 200 Americans was addicted to opiates. But wild lettuce showed no such curse. In the 1870s, Polish physicians began methodical studies. They had access to both opium and wild lettuce. They tested them side by side on patients suffering chronic pain, coughs, and insomnia. The results, published in multiple 19th-century Polish medical journals, were remarkable. One physician wrote that the action of lactucarium was weaker than that of opium, but free of the side effects. Medical practice showed that in some cases, lactucarium produced better curative effects than opium. No addiction, no respiratory depression, no euphoria that enslaved patients to the needle. By 1898, the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official compendium of approved medicines, listed wild lettuce alongside morphine and aspirin. It was standardized, tested, official. In 1911, the British Pharmaceutical Codex added it for use in lozenges, tinctures, and syrups as a sedative for irritable cough or as a mild hypnotic for insomnia. The Serval Company's 1917 medicinal plant catalogue called it highly esteemed to quiet coughing and allay nervous irritation, a good safe remedy to produce sleep, to be used when opium and other narcotics are objectionable. This was written when opium and cocaine were still sold over the counter. Wild lettuce was not a folk remedy. It was official medicine. Doctors prescribed it. Pharmacists stocked it. Patients trusted it. Then the industry shifted beneath it. The 1930s through the 1960s birthed the pharmaceutical golden age. Penicillin, sulfonamides, synthetic vitamins, antibiotics that cured tuberculosis and pneumonia for the first time in human history. But something else changed. The entire philosophy of drug discovery. Pharmaceutical companies shifted from natural products to synthetic chemistry. New laboratories abandoned beakers of plant extracts for molecular models and X-ray crystallography. Chemists learned to build molecules from scratch. Aspirin was synthesized in 1899, barbiturates appeared in 1901, and eventually Tylenol in 1955. The advantage was control. A synthetic molecule could be patented, marketed, priced, and protected. Every bottle sold generated profit for decades. Natural medicines could not. Wild lettuce grew free. Anyone could harvest it. No patent, no exclusive rights, no recurring revenue model. By the 1940s, the FDA expanded its authority. The Insulin Amendment of 1941 required all batches of insulin to be tested for purity before marketing. The Penicillin Amendment of 1945 did the same for antibiotics. Regulation tightened, and standardization became law. Wild lettuce faced a new barrier. To remain in the pharmacopoeia, it needed clinical trials, multi-phase testing, and millions of dollars in research. Who would fund that? You cannot patent a plant that grows wild. There was no financial incentive to prove what centuries already knew. In 1944, researcher Fulton published what amounted to a death sentence. Modern medicine considered its sleep-producing qualities a superstition, and its therapeutic action doubtful or nil. Never mind that it had relieved pain for 2,500 years. Never mind that Civil War surgeons used it when morphine ran out. Never mind that Polish doctors documented its safety. The study claimed commercial lactucarium preparations were without effect. Later research revealed why. The active compounds lactucan and lactucopicrin are unstable. They degrade in old preparations. Fresh lactucarium worked. Shelf-stable commercial products did not. But the damage was done. Wild lettuce fell from the pharmacopoeia. Doctors stopped prescribing it. Pharmacies stopped stocking it. A generation of physicians trained after 1950 never learned it existed. What rose in its place was an empire worth billions. The global pain relief market reached $80 billion by 2023. Over-the-counter analgesics alone generate $30 billion annually. Aspirin dominates. A Approximately 60 billion aspirin tablets are consumed worldwide each year. Americans alone ingest 34 billion. 1 trillion aspirin tablets were taken in the past century. Big Pharma built fortunes on molecules it could patent. Ibuprofen, acetaminophen, naproxen, each one protected by intellectual property law, each one sold at controlled prices, each one requiring purchase. Again and again. The genius was creating need. Pain exists. Everyone suffers at some point. Headaches, arthritis, back pain, surgical recovery. The pharmaceutical industry promised relief. For a price, $20 for a bottle of Advil, $15 for Tylenol. Multiply that by 8 billion people, recurring monthly. Companies like Bayer, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and GlaxoSmithKline built empires on this model. Marketing budgets in the billions, lobbyists in Washington, direct-to-consumer advertising that tells you to ask your doctor. But there was always a problem. Side effects. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen cause stomach ulcers and bleeding. Acetaminophen damages livers at high doses. Opioids, the most effective painkillers, created the addiction crisis, still killing 100,000 Americans per year. The search for alternatives drove research. CBD oil, turmeric, medical marijuana. Billions invested in finding non-addictive pain relief. Yet wild lettuce, proven non-addictive for 2,500 years, remained forgotten. Then, in the 1970s, something unexpected happened. The counterculture discovered it. Young people seeking legal alternatives to controlled substances found references in old herbals. Lettuce opium, they brewed teas. They smoked dried leaves. They mixed it with catnip and damiana. It was weak compared to marijuana, but it was legal. The Food and Drug Administration had never scheduled it. This brought attention, not from doctors, but from researchers. In 2005, scientists at the University of Arizona tested lactucin and lactucopacrin, the active compounds, on mice. At doses of 30 milligrams per kilogram, they produced pain relief comparable to ibuprofen. A 2021 study confirmed the mechanism. Lactucin acts as an adenosine receptor agonist. It calms nerve signals without triggering opioid receptors. No addiction pathway, no respiratory depression. The compounds also inhibit acetylcholinesterase, the same target as some Alzheimer's medications. Wild lettuce does not just dull pain, it may protect cognitive function. Today you can buy wild lettuce tinctures online, dried leaves in health stores, and capsules marketed as a natural sleep aid. Prices range from $15 to $30 per bottle. But there is a problem. Quality varies wildly. There is no FDA oversight and no standardization. Some products contain barely any lactucarium. Others are mislabeled entirely, with prickly lettuce sold as wild lettuce, though the compounds differ. Fresh lactucarium works when harvested correctly and used properly. But the knowledge of how to extract it, dry it, and dose it was lost when the last generation of pharmacists who stocked it died. The pharmaceutical industry did not set out to erase wild lettuce. They built a system where it could not compete. Patents favor synthetic molecules. Clinical trials cost millions of dollars. FDA approval requires corporate funding. Insurance reimburses brand name drugs, but not wild plants. The result is the same. A painkiller used for 2,500 years vanished, not because it failed, but because it succeeded without generating revenue. 75 million Americans suffer chronic pain. 20% of adults worldwide suffer chronic pain. The pain management industry projects $120 billion by 2033. And a plant growing in ditches, requiring no prescription, no refill, no patent, no profit, sits forgotten. Wild lettuce never left. It still grows along roadsides from California to Massachusetts, on riverbanks across Europe, and in waste ground in Iran, Austria, France, Germany, and Scotland. You can identify it if you know what to look for. A tall stem, sometimes purple-spotted, jagged leaves with spines along the center vein, and small yellow flowers. Cut the stem and white sap bleeds out. The harvest method is simple. Cut stems in late summer when the sap runs thick. Collect the latex on plates or directly into alcohol. Dry it into a brown resin or preserve it in a tincture. Fresh extraction works best because the compounds degrade in old commercial products. Herbalists still teach it. Foragers still harvest it. Small companies still sell it. The FDA never scheduled it. It remains legal to grow, possess, and use. But the medical establishment largely ignores it. Medical schools do not teach it. Doctors do not prescribe it. Pharmacies do not stock it. Insurance will not cover it. The knowledge exists in the margins. Survival blogs, homesteading forums, herbal medicine books, people who remember what their grandparents knew, and people who refuse to forget. This is what they tried to bury. Not just a plant, but the idea that relief can grow free. That medicine does not require corporations, and that knowledge can pass from hand to hand without a profit motive. The pharmaceutical industry will tell you wild lettuce is unreliable, unstandardized, and potentially dangerous. They will say modern medicine moved beyond crude plant extracts to precise synthetic molecules. They will not tell you that 25% of current pharmaceuticals are still based on plant-derived compounds. They will not tell you that morphine, still prescribed daily, comes from opium poppies. They will not tell you that aspirin was originally willow bark. They will not tell you that wild lettuce worked for 2,500 years before they decided it did not. The plant waits, in ditches, along roads, in forgotten corners where no one thinks to look. It does not need approval. It does not need marketing. It just grows. It waits for hands willing to cut the stem and collect the milk. It waits for knowledge to flow again. It belongs to the same botanical family as the flower that gives the world morphine and heroin. And yet, you could steep it into a tea, drink a cup before bed, and wake the next morning with no craving, no physical dependence, and nothing to taper off of. It dulls pain. It settles a racing mind. It eases you down into sleep, and then it lets you go, without demanding more the next night. For a pivotal stretch of American history, one of the largest drug companies in the country sold it under almost that exact description, as a sleep aid and a pain reliever, and above all, a harmless one. What almost no one remembers now is why it ever left the pharmacy shelf. It was not because it stopped working. It was because no one could own it. This is the California poppy, the flower that sets the state's hillsides on fire every spring, the one children pick without a second thought, the same plant that careful doctors once reached for when morphine was simply too dangerous to give. Long before it had an English name, the native peoples of what is now California already knew this flower intimately. Tribes across the region used the whole plant, the root, the leaf, and the petal, to ease pain, to soothe restless children, and to bring on sleep. When Spanish settlers arrived and saw entire hillsides glowing orange in the afternoon light, they called it Copa de Oro, cup of gold. The name we use today came from a ship. In the early 1800s, a Russian expedition sailed down the California coast, carrying a young surgeon and naturalist named Johann von Eschscholzia, a botanist on board named the Bright Little Flower in his honor, and the tongue-twisting Latin label stuck, Eschscholzia californica. Here is the part that still surprises people. This cheerful roadside flower belongs to the poppy family, the very same family as Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. They are botanical cousins, but they are not the same. The opium poppy carries morphine and codeine inside it. The California poppy does not. Not a trace. What it carries instead is a set of gentler plant compounds that work on the human body in a much softer register. They calm. They soothe. They loosen the physical grip of pain and worry. And they do it without the chemical hook that makes opium so dangerous. You do not build a habit. You do not chase a higher dose. That single difference is the entire story of what happened next. For a while, mainstream American medicine completely agreed. In 1890, the California poppy was proudly listed in the catalogue of Parke-Davis, then one of the most powerful pharmaceutical houses in the world. Their own entry called it an excellent soporific and analgesic, and above all, harmless. A sleep aid and a painkiller you did not have to fear. That was not a fringe herbalist talking. That was a major drug company putting its corporate name behind the plant. And it had serious backing from the doctors of the day. There was an entire branch of American medicine built around plants like this one. They were called the eclectic physicians, and they were not quacks. They ran fully accredited medical colleges, trained thousands of doctors, and wrote the definitive reference books those doctors carried in their leather bags. Two of the most respected, Harvey Wickes Felter and John Uri Lloyd, co-wrote King's American Dispensatory, one of the great medical texts of the era. They described the California poppy as an analgesic and soporific without the dangers attending opiates. It quieted pain, they wrote, and brought on a calm sleep. Think about what that meant in practice. When a patient was in real pain but could not tolerate opium, or when a doctor was afraid of what opium might do to them, this was the plant they reached for instead. A genuine pain reliever that would not enslave the person taking it. It was respectable. It was documented. It sat on pharmacy shelves right next to everything else. And for a brief moment, it looked like American medicine had found something profoundly rare. A safe answer to one of its oldest problems. That position seemed absolutely secure. It was not. The California poppy did not lose its medicine. It lost the people who stood behind it. In 1910, an educator named Abraham Flexner published a heavily funded report on American medical education. On its own terms, the Flexner report did real good. It demanded that medical schools have laboratories, and it shut down a lot of genuine diploma mills. But it drew a hard, permanent line. Medicine, it argued, should rest exclusively on what could be measured in a laboratory and manufactured in a factory. The plant-based traditions, the ones built on bedside experience rather than the test tube, were judged to have no future. The states agreed. Licensing boards fell in line with the new standards, and those standards systematically favored one kind of medicine over another. They favored the patentable pharmaceutical, the compound a company could synthesize, bottle, and legally own, over the botanical extract that anyone could grow in a field. And that is the absolute center of this whole story. You cannot patent a wildflower. The California poppy grows for free on the side of the road. No company could corner it, brand it, or set its price. A laboratory molecule, on the other hand, could be owned outright and sold for whatever the market would bear. So the money, the research, and the prestige all flowed toward the molecules. The plants were left behind for one simple reason. There was nothing in them to sell. By 1934, the head of the Eclectic Physicians' Own Association admitted almost mournfully that they faced a stark choice: be absorbed by the dominant corporate system or fold. In 1939, the last eclectic medical school in Cincinnati graduated its final class and closed its doors. The medical tradition that had vouched for the California poppy simply ceased to exist. The plant did not disappear. The highly trained people who knew how to use it did. For decades, that was the end of it. The poppy went back to being just a pretty flower by the roadside, and the science confidently moved on. Then, slowly, the laboratory circled back. In 1991, a team of French researchers published a study in the journal Planta Medica, testing what the old doctors had claimed. They found that an extract of the California poppy did, in fact, have measurable sedative and calming effects. Later work helped explain why. The plant's natural compounds appear to act on the same calming system in the brain that modern anti-anxiety drugs target, the GABA system, and on the specific receptor that benzodiazepine sedatives bind to. The old folk remedy, it turned out, had a real biological mechanism. In 2004, researchers ran a rigorous clinical trial, published in the journal Current Medical Research and Opinion. 264 patients with mild to moderate anxiety took part in a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Here the detail matters, and it is worth being precise. The treatment was not California poppy alone. It was a fixed botanical combination of California poppy, hawthorn, and magnesium. That combination beat the placebo at easing anxiety over 3 months. So the poppy was one part of a team in that trial, not a solo act, but it earned its place on the team. Today, the medical recognition is official in at least one country. Health Canada permits a California poppy product to be sold specifically as a mild sedative and an aid for managing chronic pain. A modern government health authority is signing off on the same use of pharmacy catalogue described back in 1890. One honest word of caution, because this audience is sharp, and many of you take prescriptions. Because the plant works on that same calming system as prescription sedatives and anxiety medication. Anyone already taking those should talk with their own doctor before adding it. This is gentle, but it is not weightless. Here is the part of the story that should make you smile. While the institutions that vouched for the California poppy were closing their doors, the plant itself was being honored by the very state it was named for. In 1903, California named it the official state flower. It has held that title for more than a century. Every April, it still puts on the same show it put on for the native peoples who first used it. Whole hillsides go brilliant gold. In places like the Antelope Valley north of Los Angeles, the bloom is so vast that people drive for hours just to stand in an endless field of orange and look at it. You have almost certainly seen it without knowing what you were looking at. On a roadside, in a meadow, painted across a vintage postcard of California. That is the strange, poetic justice of this archive. The patented laboratory molecules that were supposed to replace it have their own long history now, including a devastating opioid crisis that has touched nearly every family in this country. And the gentle flower that careful doctors once reached for instead, the one no corporation could ever own, never went anywhere at all. It outlasted the catalogue that praised it. It outlasted the colleges that studied it. It is still here, blooming for free, every single spring. It was never lost. We just stopped recognizing it. If a flower you have driven past 1,000 times turned out to carry a hidden history like this one, there are dozens more just like it waiting in the vault. In the winter of 1882, a 22-year-old woman named Margaret Sullivan was admitted to the Trudeau Sanatorium in Saranac Lake, New York. She was coughing blood. Her lungs were filling with the bacterial infection that had killed her mother 3 years earlier, and it was now killing 1 in 7 Americans every year. The doctors at Trudeau had no antibiotics, streptomycin would not be discovered for another 62 years. What they had was rest, fresh mountain air, beef broth, cod liver oil, and one specific plant remedy that had been used against this disease for 1,800 years. The remedy was a tea brewed from the dried leaves and yellow flowers of a tall, fuzzy plant that grew along every roadside in upstate New York. The Trudeau staff harvested it themselves from the fields outside the sanatorium walls. They steeped it in boiling water, strained it through cheesecloth, and gave it to patients 3 times a day to soothe the inflamed bronchial tissue and help them clear the bloody mucus from their lungs. Margaret Sullivan survived. She was discharged in the spring of 1884 and lived another 47 years. The plant that helped her survive grows along the same American roadsides today. It produces a yellow flower spike that can reach 10 feet tall by the end of its second summer. The leaves are soft and silver green, covered in fine hairs that feel like felt. You have driven past it 10,000 times. Hippocrates prescribed it 2,400 years ago. The Greek physician Dioscorides catalogued it in the 1st century AD as a remedy for lung disease. Nicholas Culpeper's 1653 English herbal recommended it for every respiratory ailment known to medicine. The Cherokee, Mohegan, Menominee, Penobscot, and Coast Salish all used it. American settlers carried the seeds across the continent. The U.S. Pharmacopoeia listed it as an official medicine. Today, the global market for prescription respiratory inhalers is worth billions of dollars per year. The active ingredient in the most common rescue inhaler, albuterol, is a synthetic chemical patented in 1966. The plant Margaret Sullivan was given is completely free. Almost no American doctor has ever recommended it. This is the story of Mullein, the lungwort, the Quaker's rouge, the Aaron's rod. The plant that helped humanity breathe for 2,400 years, growing in plain sight in the country that has forgotten its name. The archive opens in the 1st century AD. The Greek military physician Pedanius Dioscorides, traveling with the Roman army across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, compiles De Materia Medica, the pharmaceutical reference text that will dominate Western medicine for the next 1,500 years. In Book 4, he describes a tall, yellow-flowered plant he calls phlomos. He prescribes the leaves and flowers for lung disorders, persistent coughs, asthma, and what he calls the spitting of blood. That last symptom is what 19th century Americans would call consumption, and what modern doctors call pulmonary tuberculosis. The plant Dioscorides was describing is Verbascum thapsus, the common mullein. By the 4th century AD, Roman cattlemen across Europe were using it to treat respiratory disease in their cows. The English nickname bullock's lungwort dates from this period. The plant became so closely associated with respiratory medicine that medieval European healers carried dried mullein leaves, the way modern medics carry epinephrine. In the 1653 publication of The Complete Herbal, the English botanist Nicholas Culpeper writes that mullein is of a peculiar property to ease the chest of all manner of phlegmatic and rheumatic distempers. Across the Atlantic in the same century, mullein was already established in North America. European colonists brought the seeds. Native American tribes immediately recognized the medicine. The Cherokee brewed the leaves into tea for coughs and asthma. The Mohegan dried the leaves and smoked them in clay pipes for chest congestion, a practice still preserved in modern herbal smoking blends. The Menominee, the Forest Potawatomi, and the Penobscot all used the smoke from smoldering mullein leaves to relieve asthma attacks. The Navajo and the Coast Salish included it in healing ceremonies. By 1700, mullein was naturalized across every state east of the Mississippi. In the 19th century, as American cities filled with immigrants and industrial pollution, tuberculosis became the single largest cause of death in the United States. By 1880, 1 in 7 Americans was dying of consumption. The disease attacked the lungs slowly, over months and years, and there was no cure. Sanatoriums opened across the country. The most famous was the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium, founded in 1885 by Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau in Saranac Lake, New York. Trudeau's protocol included sunlight, mountain air, a high-fat diet, and respiratory herbs. Mullein was a staple. The dried leaves were brewed into tea and given to patients 3 times a day. The mechanism, which would not be understood for another 80 years, is that the saponins in mullein leaf physically thin and mobilize the thick mucus produced by infected bronchial tissue, while the mucilage coats and soothes the inflamed mucous membranes. The Verbascum in the flowers reduces inflammation through the same biochemical pathway that modern corticosteroid inhalers target. By the early 20th century, Mullein was an official drug. It was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the legal reference book that defined what American doctors could prescribe. It was listed in the British Pharmacopoeia, the German Pharmacopoeia, and the French Codex. Every doctor trained before 1920 knew it. Then, in 1910, an American educator named Abraham Flexner published a report that would change Western medicine forever. The Flexner Report was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation to evaluate the state of American medical education. Flexner visited 155 medical schools and concluded that most of them were inadequate. His recommendations reshaped American medicine. Schools that taught herbal medicine, homeopathy, eclectic medicine, or any approach not based on pharmaceutical chemistry were closed or defunded. By 1920, the number of American medical schools had been cut nearly in half. The schools that survived were the ones that taught the new pharmaceutical model. The Rockefeller Foundation, whose Standard Oil holdings produced the petroleum derivatives used to synthesize the new drugs, funded the survivors directly. Mullein was removed from the United States Pharmacopoeia. It became, officially, not a drug. American doctors stopped learning about it. American pharmacists stopped stocking it. By 1940, 2 generations of physicians had been trained to consider plant medicine the practice of country doctors and superstitious folk healers. In 1944, streptomycin was discovered. By 1947, it was being mass-produced. Tuberculosis, the disease that had killed Margaret Sullivan's mother and 1 million other Americans a year, became a curable condition. Mullein was no longer needed, but asthma, bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and respiratory infection were still everywhere. Smoking had created a generation of damaged lungs. Industrial pollution had created another: coal dust, asbestos, urban smog. By the 1960s, American emergency rooms were filling with people who could not breathe. In 1966, a research team at Allen and Hanbury's, a British pharmaceutical subsidiary of Glaxo, synthesized a chemical called salbutamol. Marketed in the United States as albuterol, it was a beta-2 adrenergic receptor agonist that relaxed the smooth muscle around the bronchial tubes in seconds. The FDA approved it in 1981. By the 1990s, it was the standard rescue medication for asthma worldwide. The patented brand name was Ventolin. Today, the global bronchodilator market is worth $23.64 billion per year and projected to reach $32.94 billion by 2034. Albuterol alone generates $4.59 billion annually. The combined market for asthma and COPD therapeutics is $92.3 billion and projected to reach $155.25 billion by 2030. GlaxoSmithKline, AstraZeneca, Teva Pharmaceuticals, Merck, and Boehringer Ingelheim divide this market between them. A single Ventolin inhaler, before insurance, retails in the United States for between $50 and $80. A typical asthmatic patient uses 12 to 24 inhalers per year, an annual cost of $600 to nearly $2,000. The patent on the original formulation expired in the early 2010s, allowing generic competition, but the price remains expensive because the pharmaceutical industry has continuously developed new combination inhalers that pair albuterol with corticosteroids and reset the patent clock. The plant that produces the same expectorant action mechanically cannot be patented. In 2010, a research team led by Carla Speranza at the University of Naples Federico II published a study in the journal Comparative Biochemistry and Physiology, examining the anti-inflammatory action of Verbascum, the principal active compound in Mullein flowers. They reproduced an inflammatory state in human leukemia cells, then treated the cells with Verbascum. The compound significantly reduced the expression and activity of inducible nitric oxide synthase, the same inflammatory enzyme that modern corticosteroid asthma medications target. It reduced the production of superoxide free radicals. The mechanism was identical to anti-inflammatory pharmaceutical action. In 2019, a Spanish research team led by Alejandra González at the University of Salamanca tested standardized Mullein extract on guinea pig tracheal tissue. At a concentration of 100 micrograms per milliliter, the extract produced significant airway relaxation. The mechanism was bronchodilatory, the same physical effect that albuterol produces. In 2021, an Iranian clinical trial led by Mohammad Jahan tested Mullein syrup against placebo in 40 children with persistent cough. After 7 days, the Mullein group reported 60% greater symptom reduction. The result was statistically significant. The German Commission E, the European regulatory body that evaluated herbal medicines for the German government for over 2 decades, approved Mullein flower in 1990 for the treatment of respiratory catarrh. This is one of the most rigorous herbal medicine approvals in Western regulatory history. The FDA has never issued any equivalent recognition. In the United States, mullein remains classified as a dietary supplement. Producers cannot legally make any medical claim about it, but the medicine is still there. It is free for the cutting. You can identify mullein anywhere in America from June through September. In the first year, it grows as a low rosette of large, soft, silver-green leaves. The leaves feel like felt or velvet. They are covered in fine hairs that catch the light. In the second year, the plant sends up a single tall flowering stalk that can reach 6 to 10 feet, covered in small yellow flowers with 5 petals. It grows in disturbed soil along highways, railroad tracks, abandoned lots, and field edges. It thrives in poor soil, and it needs no water. A single mature plant produces over 200,000 seeds. Harvest the leaves in the first year, before the plant flowers, when the medicinal compounds are concentrated. Choose plants growing well away from roadsides and farm fields, since the felted leaves trap dust and chemical residue. Cut the leaves in the morning after the dew has dried. Hang them in small bunches in a dark, well-ventilated space for 2 weeks until they are completely dry and crumble easily. For respiratory tea, use 1 teaspoon of dried mullein leaf per cup of boiling water. Steep for 10 minutes. Strain the tea through a coffee filter or fine cheesecloth because the small hairs from the leaves can irritate the throat if not removed. Drink up to 3 cups per day during respiratory illness. The yellow flowers, harvested in the second year, are even more medicinally valuable than the leaves. They are traditionally infused in olive oil for 2 weeks in a sunny window, then strained. The infused oil is the most effective traditional remedy for ear infection, applied a few drops at a time directly into the affected ear. Margaret Sullivan walked out of the Trudeau Sanatorium in the spring of 1884 and lived to be 70 years old. The doctors who saved her life were trained in a medical tradition that recognized plants as medicine. That tradition was systematically dismantled between 1910 and 1940. The plant that helped her breathe still grows along every roadside in upstate New York. The bronchodilator industry will earn $32 billion next year. The plant grows free in the ditch outside your driveway. We did not lose Mullein, we just stopped looking down. There is a plant growing in the ditches along American roads right now, in the cracked soil of old farmsteads, in the weedy edges where nobody bothers to look. Almost no one walking past it could tell you its name. But the people who study plants for a living gave it one almost 300 years ago, and that name, written in the official language of science, means of the heart. For nearly 2,000 years, physicians and midwives reached for it when a pulse raced for no reason, when the nerves would not settle, when an aging heart fluttered and skipped. They wrote it into their medical texts. They built it into the names of things. And then, in the span of about 40 years, it was written out of medicine entirely. It was not taken out because it failed. It was taken out because something more profitable took its place. The plant is Leonurus cardiaca. Almost everyone who remembers it at all calls it Motherwort. The archive opens in the year 1753. That was the year the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus sat down to give every known plant a formal scientific name, the system we still use today. When he came to this one, a tough, square-stemmed weed from the mint family, he did something revealing. He named the genus Leonurus, from the Greek for lion's tail, after the bristling shape of its flower spikes. Then he reached for the species name, and he chose cardiaca, of the heart. Linnaeus was not guessing. He was writing down what every herbalist in Europe already treated as common knowledge, that this plant belonged to the heart. The common name carries the other half of the story. Motherwort. Wort is simply the Old English word for a useful plant. The mother came from the midwives, who for generations kept it close for women in the hard hours after childbirth. So the names themselves became a kind of record, one half pointing to the heart, the other to the women who trusted it. 100 years before Linnaeus, the English physician Nicholas Culpeper had already put it in writing. In his herbal of 1653, he recommended Motherwort to drive melancholy from the heart and to settle a racing, troubled mind, writing that there was no better herb to make a cheerful soul. Decades before that, John Gerard had said much the same in his great catalogue of plants. The same 3 uses, written down over and over by serious men who had no reason to agree, and yet did. For the heart, for the nerves, and for the women who relied on it. By the time medicine reached America, Motherwort was not folklore, it was official. In 1898, 2 of the most respected pharmacists in the country, Harvey Felter and John Uri Lloyd, published the King's American Dispensatory, a reference that doctors across the United States kept on their shelves. Motherwort is in it. They listed it as a tonic for the nerves and for the heart, recommended where the heartbeat was disturbed by worry rather than by disease. This was mainstream practice. Thousands of trained American physicians, the ones known as eclectics, prescribed plants like this every day. Lloyd in particular spent his life defending that tradition, insisting that a remedy growing in a field could be every bit as real as one mixed in a laboratory. For a while the country agreed with him. If the story had stopped in 1898, Motherwort might still be in your doctor's bag today. But it did not stop there. Around the turn of the 20th century, modern medicine fell in love with a new idea. Not the plant, but the molecule, the single, isolated, measurable compound that could be purified, standardized, and, above all, sold. The same impulse that gave medicine some of its greatest cures was about to erase the plant that had pointed the way. The template came from another heart plant, the foxglove. Back in 1785, an English doctor named William Withering had shown that foxglove could steady a failing heart. By the late 1800s, German chemists had pulled the active compound out of it. Then, in 1930, a chemist named Sidney Smith, working for the drug company Burroughs Wellcome, isolated a refined version called digoxin. It went on sale as a patented pharmaceutical, a single molecule, a single dose, and a single company that owned it. You cannot bottle a ditch. Motherwort grew for free on every roadside in America, which made it worth nothing to a company that needed something to sell. And the rules of medicine were being rewritten to favor exactly the kind of product a company could sell. In 1905, the American Medical Association created a council to decide which drugs were approved and which were not, and it leaned toward the standardized and the manufactured. 5 years later, in 1910, a report written by Abraham Flexner and funded by the Carnegie Foundation reshaped every medical school in the country, pushing out the ones that taught about plants. One by one, the colleges that had trained those herbal physicians ran out of students and closed. The last of them, the Eclectic Medical Institute of Cincinnati, closed in 1939. Lloyd fought to keep that knowledge alive. It did not matter. In plain terms, a plant that had served the human heart for nearly 2,000 years was retired from medicine in less time than a single lifetime. It was not disproven in a laboratory, and it was not shown to be dangerous. It was simply left off the page, because the page now belonged to something that could be billed. For most of the 20th century, that was the end of it. Motherwort sat in the ditches, ignored. But the plant never read the verdict. And eventually, the scientists came back. When modern laboratories finally looked inside the leaves, they found a real and unusual compound. They named it leonorine after the plant. In peer-reviewed journals, researchers documented that leonorine relaxes and widens blood vessels, the kind of action that eases a strained circulatory system. In 2011, a study published in the journal Phytotherapy Research followed patients who had high blood pressure, along with anxiety and trouble sleeping. The group given a motherwort extract showed improvement across all three: calmer, steadier, sleeping better. 2 years later, a review in the same journal pulled the wider evidence together, cataloging the plant's chemistry and its documented effects on the cardiovascular system and on the nerves. Now read that against the words Culpeper wrote in 1653. To settle a racing, troubled mind. To make a cheerful soul. A modern journal, using instruments he could never have imagined, had confirmed what he set down by candlelight more than 300 years before. The old herbalists were not making it up. They were simply early. But this was never only a story about the past. It is about the ground right outside your door, because here is what makes all of it almost absurd. This plant is not rare. It is not hidden in some distant forest. It is probably growing within a few miles of where you are sitting right now. If you want to find it, learn its shape. The stem is square, not round, the signature of the mint family, and you can feel the four edges if you roll it between your fingers. The leaves are deeply cut, almost like a hand with sharp fingers, darker on top and pale underneath. In summer it sends up tall spikes, and tucked into the place where each pair of leaves meets the stem, you will find small whorls of pale pink and purple flowers, slightly spiny to the touch. Crush a leaf and it is bitter, unmistakably bitter. It favors the forgotten places. roadsides, fence lines, the edges of old barns, and abandoned homesteads across the eastern and central states. For centuries, people gathered the flowering tops in summer, dried them, and kept them through the winter as a simple tea, the same way they kept any common medicine before the pharmacy existed. The plant asks for nothing: no fertilizer, no permission, no purchase. It is the plant your grandparents' generation could have named on sight, waiting in the cold ground for someone to remember it is still there. Carl Linnaeus wrote the heart into its name in 1753, and the name never changed. Open any modern botanical record today and it is still there. Leonurus cardiaca, of the heart. The knowledge was never disproven. It was just outsold. It did not die. It went dormant, the way the plant itself sleeps through winter, waiting for the spring. And it is still there, in the ditch, on the fence line, carrying a 2,000-year-old name that tells you exactly what it was for, if you only know how to read it. Every year, Americans pour more than $2 billion onto their lawns to destroy the plants growing in them. Herbicides, selective sprays, pre-emergent treatments, all of it aimed at the green things that dare to grow where they were not specifically invited. And every year, in the exact same country, infections that no antibiotic can stop claim more lives than they did the year before. Today, 1.3 million deaths a year trace directly to bacteria that have learned to shrug off our strongest drugs. That is more than HIV, more than malaria. The deadliest of them all is one doctor's name with a kind of dread, MRSA. And right now, it is winning. Hold those two facts next to each other for a second, because almost nobody does. We are spending an absolute fortune to eradicate a specific category of plant. And inside the leaves of one of those plants is some of the most highly studied natural defense against the exact bacteria that is currently killing us. This is not folklore. This is documented in peer-reviewed laboratories. There is one plant in particular growing right now within a few feet of most front doors in America. Researchers have tested it against drug-resistant staph and watched it heal an infected wound. Yet people have been pulling it out of the ground in absolute frustration for 1,000 years. The ancient Saxons believed it was worth protecting. It turns out they were onto something we are only now confirming. You know this plant. You have almost certainly cursed at it. It spreads by runners that creep along the soil and root at every single node, so when you pull one strand, you leave behind 10 more. It survives frost. It survives drought. It survives the chemical assault you throw at it and comes back the next spring like absolutely nothing happened. The archive opens on Glaucoma hederacea. Most people know it as Creeping Charlie, or ground ivy, or gill over the ground. But its oldest name tells the real story. Alehouf. That name is a clue, and it points to a historical crime that happened in the year 1516. But first, the plant itself. Its medicinal record is not vague. It is filled with specific names and exact dates. Galen, the Greek physician whose work shaped medicine for 1,000 years, recommended it for inflammation. Hildegard of Bingen, the German abbess and healer, recorded its use for ringing in the ears back in the 12th century. In 1597, the English herbalist John Gerard wrote it into his massive medical text, calling it a tonic, an astringent, and a gentle stimulant. By the early 1800s, American settler physicians had carried it across the ocean and were using it for so many things that in England it was simply called a cure-all. Then it fell out of the books. Not because it stopped working, because something replaced it, and that something could be controlled. To understand that, you have to understand the name Alehouf. For thousands of years, beer was not made with hops. Ale was bittered and preserved with a mixture of herbs called gruit, and one of the most common herbs in that mixture was this exact plant. It clarified the beer, it preserved it, it flavored it. The Saxons brewed with it, the English brewed with it, and the names stuck. Alehoof, Tunhoof, Gill over the ground. All of them brewing words for a brewing herb. Here is where the history turns. The right to sell gruit was not free. In much of Northern Europe, brewing was a strict monopoly. The Gruitrecht, held by the church, by bishops, and by the nobility, who ran licensed gruit houses and aggressively taxed every single batch. The herbs were the product, and the product was controlled. Hops were different. Hops were a cultivated crop. You could grow them on a massive farm, count them, regulate them, and tax them at the point of production. A wild herb that anyone could pick for free from a meadow could not be taxed the same way. So when the rulers of Bavaria passed their famous purity law in 1516, restricting beer to only water, barley, and hops, they did something that sounded like quality control, but worked like a corporate takeover. They legislated an ancient herbal tradition completely out of existence. A free herb the common people grew themselves was permanently replaced by a crop the powerful could own. That was round one. The plant survived it, of course. It always does. But the human knowledge started to thin. Now, the part the modern laboratories are finally confirming. The leaves of this plant contain ursolic acid and rosmarinic acid, compounds that show massive antibacterial activity in study after study. In 2023, researchers ran the plant through detailed chemical analysis, isolated the ursolic acid, and tested the extract against multi-drug-resistant clinical samples of Staphylococcus aureus, the exact bacterial family that includes MRSA. It suppressed them. Then they took it further, into an animal model. An extract gel was applied to an infected wound. It brought the bacterial load down compared to a standard pharmacy ointment, and the wound completely closed, with new skin and new hair, inside of 10 days. This is a laboratory and an animal result. It is not yet a human trial. Anyone who tells you this is a proven pharmaceutical cure is getting ahead of the science. But the trajectory is undeniably consistent across centuries of traditional use and across modern study, and it points directly at the exact problem keeping infectious disease doctors up at night. But here is the most important detail in this entire archive. When modern scientists first tested industrial preparations of this plant, the standardized tinctures manufactured for a long shelf life, some of them came back showing almost nothing, completely inactive. And that is exactly how a real medicine gets dismissed as a peasant superstition. You test it wrong, you get nothing, and you write it off. These compounds are incredibly fragile. The triterpenes that actually matter are barely soluble in water, so a quick cup of hot tea pulls out almost none of them. High heat chemically degrades the delicate parts. The old healers knew to prepare it cold, or extract it in fat, or in alcohol. Not because they understood the microscopic chemistry, but because 1,000 years of quiet observation had taught them exactly what worked. Modern medicine forgot the preparation, tested the wrong version, and confidently concluded the plant was nothing. The plant was never nothing. The knowledge of how to use it was what we lost. Which brings the story all the way home to your own lawn. This plant is still being aggressively targeted right now. There has been no real biological control research from the United States Department of Agriculture. The official answer to ground ivy is simply chemical, the exact same herbicide names sitting on the shelf at every garden store. The herb the Saxons protected and brewed and healed with is, in modern America, just a line item on a plastic bottle of weed killer. There is a terrifying, strange symmetry to it. a plant we cannot kill that survives absolutely everything, sitting quietly in the cracks of the sidewalk. While the bacteria we are desperately trying to kill learns to survive everything we have, one of them has been on our side the entire time. The plant does not need you to water it, feed it, or protect it. It has handled all of that entirely on its own for centuries. It only needs one thing from you, and it is the easiest thing in the world to give. The next time you reach for the chemical sprayer, walk past it instead, and go look up how the old brewers prepared it cold. That single change is where the lost knowledge starts coming back. If this vault changed how you see the weeds in your own grass, then do not let this knowledge disappear again. On almost every street in America, there is a tree you have walked past 1,000 times without once looking up. In the last week of June, it does something strange. The whole crown begins to hum, loud enough to hear from across the road, because every honeybee for a mile has come to drink from its flowers. In Berlin, the grandest boulevard in the city is named after this tree. In France, grandmothers have steeped its blossoms into a soft, golden bedtime tea for more than 300 years. And here in America, where it shades more streets and parks than almost any tree we plant, almost no one drinks it. The blossoms perfume the whole block, then fall to the sidewalk and get swept into the gutter. The tree Europe built boulevards around, and America sweeps into the drain, is the linden. For most of the people watching this, that is the whole relationship. A nuisance that drops sticky flowers on the car. But 200 years ago, your own great-grandparents, on one side of the ocean or the other, knew exactly what to do with those flowers. Somewhere between then and now, the knowledge slipped out of the American kitchen. That knowledge was never lost. It was only set down. And we are about to pick it back up. This story does not begin on an American street. It begins in the old forests and village squares of Europe, where the linden has been a sacred tree for as long as anyone has kept records. Germanic villages held their councils and their courts beneath a central linden. Lovers met under it. Some of those trees are still standing today, 700, even 1,000 years old, older than the countries around them. The Germans call the flowers Lindenblüten. The French call the tree tilleul, and a cup of tilleul before bed is still as ordinary in a French home as chamomile is here. Every summer, the same routine repeated across France, Germany, and the Balkans. When the trees bloomed, families gathered the flowers by the basket, dried them in the shade, and stored them in jars for the long winter. A homemade pharmacy for fevers, head colds, restless nerves, and children who would not sleep. But the linden was never only Europe's tree. And here is the part most people never hear. North America has its own native linden, the tree we call basswood. And the people who lived here long before us knew it just as intimately, only for something different. Indigenous nations across the eastern woodlands stripped the soft inner bark, soaked it in water for weeks until the fibers loosened, and twisted those fibers into rope, fishing nets, baskets, and woven mats strong enough to last for years. The same tree fed their bees and softened under their carving knives. 2 continents, 2 peoples, 1 tree. And on both sides of the ocean, it was treated as something useful, even holy. So how did half of that knowledge go missing on this side of the water? The answer is not a villain. Nobody outlawed the linden. No government agency declared it dangerous, and no company bought up the groves and locked them away. What happened to it in America is quieter than that, and in a way much harder to fix. Start with how this country chose to see the tree. To a European, the linden was a medicine tree first. To an American lumberman, it was basswood. And basswood was money of a very different kind. The wood is pale, light, and so soft and even-grained that it carves like butter. By the 1800s, American mills were turning it into shipping crates, yardsticks, broom handles, piano keys, window blinds, and the hidden frames of cheap furniture. We looked at one of the great medicine trees of the world, and we saw lumber. So we planted it everywhere, by the thousands, for shade and for timber, and never once thought to look at the flowers. Then came the second turn, and this one seemed small at the time. It wasn't. In the early decades of the 20th century, American medicine moved indoors and into bottles. The corner pharmacy and the brand name Remedy replaced the kettle on the stove. A tea you had to climb a tree to gather could not compete with a manufactured pill you could buy on the way home. Nobody decided to forget the Linden. It simply stopped being handed down. One generation quit brewing it, the next never watched them do it, and within about 50 years, a tree that had been a household name on 2 continents became, to most Americans, just the messy thing dropping flowers on the driveway. Here is what makes that forgetting a real loss, and not just nostalgia. When modern chemists finally looked closely at Linden flowers, they found the old grandmothers were onto something. The blossoms are loaded with plant compounds called flavonoids, including one named tillerost, along with quercetin and kaempferol. In animal studies, extracts of linden flower calmed the central nervous system in a measurable way. In one of those experiments, the extract deepened and lengthened sleep and reduced anxious behavior. Researchers believe it works partly by nudging the same calming pathway in the brain that many prescription sedatives target, only far more gently. A team led by a researcher named Coleta, publishing in the journal Pharmacopsychiatry in 2001, tested Linden against anxiety in a standard laboratory model and saw a clear calming effect. The following year, a separate group led by Matsuda isolated that compound, telluroside, from the flowers and showed it helped protect the liver in lab models. Now, the honest part, because this channel does not deal in fairy tales. Think about that record for a second before anyone oversells it. The 2 small human studies on Linden's calming effect actually disagreed with each other, and the large gold standard human trials still have not been done. So what we really have is 300 years of consistent use across many cultures, plus early laboratory work pointing in the same direction. That is not proof of a cure. It is something more honest, and frankly more interesting. It is a folk remedy that modern science keeps finding reasons to take seriously. Even Europe's drug regulator, the European Medicines Agency, formally lists linden flower as a traditional herbal remedy for stress and the common cold, and simply advises keeping it to about 2 cups a day. So let's make sure you can actually use it, because this is the easiest harvest in the whole forest. Finding the tree is simple once you know the trick. Look for leaves shaped like a Valentine heart, with a base that is slightly lopsided, one side higher than the other. Then look for the giveaway no other tree has. The flowers do not hang from a normal stem. They dangle beneath a pale, papery, strap-shaped little wing, a modified leaf called a bract, as if the tree attached each cluster of flowers to its own tiny green sail. When you see those sails in late June and early July, you have found a linden. If you cannot spot them, close your eyes and follow the humming bees and the smell of honey. Harvest the flowers with that pale wing still attached on a dry morning, just as they open, when the perfume is at its strongest. You can brew them fresh or dry them in the shade and keep them in a jar all winter, exactly the way a French grandmother does. To make the tea, drop a small handful of fresh flowers or a heaping spoonful of dried ones into a mug. Pour water that has just come off the boil, cover it so the aroma stays trapped inside, and let it steep for a few minutes. What you get is pale gold, faintly sweet, somewhere between honey and warm hay. If you can find basswood honey from the same kind of tree, stir a little in. Keep it gentle, and keep it sensible. About 2 cups a day is the amount Europe has leaned on for generations. It can make you pleasantly drowsy, so this is an evening drink, not a morning one, and not something to have right before you drive. And if you want one more gift from the tree, the young spring leaves before they toughen are a mild, edible salad green soft enough to go straight into a sandwich. The pharmacy on the corner locks its glass doors at night. The Linden 2 doors down never does. Which brings us back to that humming tree on your street and the flowers in the gutter. They were never trash. For most of human history, on both sides of the ocean, those exact blossoms were treasure, gathered by the basket and guarded in jars against the coming winter. The tree did not change. It still blooms every summer, still calls in the bees, still offers the same quiet medicine it always has. The only thing that changed is that we stopped reaching up to take it. This year, when you hear that tree start to hum, you will know exactly what it is, and exactly what to do. Somewhere tonight, an older man is lying awake because the ache in his legs will not let him rest. He has 2 choices, and he knows both of them by heart. He can take the pill that works, the one that does a little less each month, the one his daughter has secretly started to worry about. Or he can lie there and wait for the sun. Millions of Americans know that exact trade. Relief or your freedom, almost never both. But a little over a decade ago, a pharmacologist in California opened up an ordinary root that people in China had trusted for 2,000 years and found something inside it that should have changed that math. A compound that silenced pain the way morphine does. And unlike morphine, it never tightened its grip. This is the story of Corydalis yanhusuo, and why the most promising painkiller you have never heard of is still sitting on a shelf. This story does not begin in a laboratory. It begins in the mountain provinces of China, more than 2,000 years ago, with a plant that looks like nothing special. Small, fern-like leaves, pale purple flowers in spring, and a knot of pale tubers hidden under the soil. Its Chinese name is yanhusuo. It belongs to the poppy family, the same family that gave the world its oldest and most powerful painkillers. But this cousin took a very different path. For most of recorded Chinese medical history, healers dug up the root, dried it, ground it down, and boiled it in vinegar. They reached for it to treat headaches, cramps, chest pain, and the deep, aching kind of pain that settles in after an injury and never fully leaves. They did not know the chemistry of why it worked. They only knew, generation after generation, that it did. In 2014, a team set out to find out why. At the University of California, Irvine, a neuropharmacologist named Olivier Civelli partnered with chemists at the Dalian Institute of Chemical Physics in China. It was part of a larger effort to catalog the compounds inside plants that heal. Their goal was simple to say, and hard to do. Take a remedy people had trusted for centuries and pull out the single molecule responsible. Think of it like dismantling a recipe handed down for 2,000 years just to find the one ingredient doing all the heavy lifting. After working through the plant's chemistry, they landed on a single compound with a long, unwieldy name, dihydrocorybulbine, and then they tested it the way modern science tests everything, carefully, in animals, against the kinds of pain that hurt people the most. What they found is the reason this episode exists. In rodents, The compound pushed back 3 different kinds of pain. The sharp, sudden kind, the inflammatory kind that comes with swelling and tissue damage, and the hardest kind of all, neuropathic pain, the burning, electric pain of damaged nerves. If you have ever had shingles, or the pins and needles of diabetic neuropathy, or sciatica that runs down your leg like a live wire, you already know the kind of pain modern medicine struggles to touch. That last one is exactly where this compound worked. The university's own announcement put it plainly. Chronic pain like this affects more than 50 million Americans, and managing it remains one of the great unsolved problems in medicine. Here was a remedy from a common root, easing it in the lab. But the result that made the researchers lean in was the one almost everyone missed. Morphine works by latching onto what scientists call the opioid receptors. That is what makes it so powerful, and it is also what makes it so dangerous because the body adapts, demands more, and learns to lean on it. The compound from the root did not work through the morphine receptor at all. It worked through a different system entirely. The receptors that respond to dopamine. A different door into the same room. And here is the detail that explains everything that came after. In the experiments, the animals given the compound did not build a tolerance. Day after day, the same dose kept working. Morphine, in the same kind of testing, slowly stops being enough. This molecule simply did not fade. Civelli and his colleagues published all of it in the journal Current Biology in January of 2014, under a title that did not exaggerate a single word. A novel analgesic isolated from a traditional Chinese medicine. And the timing of it all could not have been heavier. 2014 was the height of America's opioid crisis. These were the years when families across the country were learning, the hard way, that the medicines meant to take away physical pain could take away everything else. Doctors were caught between letting people suffer and handing them something that could pull them under. You would think a non-opioid painkiller that worked on severe nerve pain and did not build tolerance would have been rushed into every research lab in the country. It was not. So what happened to it? The honest answer is the frustrating one, and it is not a conspiracy. 2 things stood in the way, and neither of them was about whether the compound worked. The first is real and fair. Before anything from a plant can become a medicine you take, it has to be tested for safety, slowly and expensively. Civelli himself said the compound still needed that work. The second reason explains why that work never got funded. You cannot patent a root. Corydalis has grown in the ground for millions of years. The molecule inside it belongs to nature, not to a corporation. And the clinical trials that turn a promising compound into an approved medicine cost hundreds of millions of dollars. No company spends that kind of money on something it cannot own at the end. So the most interesting painkiller of 2014 did not fail. It was simply never developed further. It got a brief flurry of headlines, a permanent place in the scientific record, and then the silence that settles over anything that cannot be sold. Here is where things stand today. The compound itself, isolated and purified in that lab, is still not a medicine your doctor can prescribe. That part has not changed. If the science had been carried forward, this might be a very different story, the kind with a clean and happy ending. It was not carried forward, so it is not that kind of story yet. But the root itself never went anywhere. Corydalis yanhusuo is still one of the most widely used remedies in traditional Chinese medicine, sold as dried root and as extract in herbal shops around the world, just as it has been for 2,000 years. The molecule the California lab got so excited about is still inside it, where it always was. The plant did not need the headlines. It did not need a patent. It just kept doing the one thing it has always done, while the system that studied it moved on to the things it could own. Remember the man we started with, lying awake in the dark, choosing between relief and his freedom. He is real, in the sense that millions of people make that exact choice tonight. And the hard part of this story is that the choice might not have been necessary. A decade ago, in a lab in California, the outline of a different answer appeared, inside a root that ordinary people had trusted for 2,000 years. The science is still sitting there in the record, finished enough to be promising, unfinished enough to be forgotten, waiting for someone with the resources and the reason to pick it back up. In 1908, diggers pulled more than 300,000 pounds of a single wild root out of the American woods. In 1 year, it sat in nearly every frontier medicine cabinet from Vermont down to Georgia. It was printed in the official doctor's dispensatories, the exact books a trained physician reached for before almost anything else. And then the doctors who understood it best were pushed out of the profession, and the plant itself was dug to the brink of extinction. It still grows today, in the cool shade of old hardwood forests, glowing faintly yellow under the fallen leaves. Most people walk right past it. The plant is Goldenseal. Botanists call it Hydrastis canadensis, the only member of its genus, a low woodland herb in the buttercup family. The old-timers called it orange root or yellow root because of what you find when you dig it up. A knotted underground stem the color of a fresh egg yolk. It grew across a huge sweep of the country, from Vermont and Ontario down to Georgia and west toward Arkansas, always tucked into the rich, shaded floor of the hardwoods. Long before it carried a Latin name, the Cherokee and the Iroquois already knew it intimately. They used that brilliant yellow rhizome 2 ways: as a dye, for cloth, for baskets, even for body paint, and as medicine. A wash for sore eyes and irritated skin, and a bitter tonic taken for a weak stomach. When European settlers reached the eastern forests, they watched, and they copied. They came to lean on it as an eye remedy so often that 2 of its common names became eye balm and eye root. A plant most of us have never heard of was, for a very long time, one of the most trusted remedies on the continent. By 1830, Goldenseal had moved from the cabin shelf into the formal medical record. That year, a physician named John King listed it in his American Dispensatory, one of the heavy reference books that regular doctors actually used. Chemists started taking the root apart to understand it. They found berberine, the alkaloid behind that strong yellow color. They found hydrastine, first isolated by a Philadelphia pharmacist back in the 1820s. And they found a third compound, canadine. Here is the detail most people miss. This was not folk superstition that doctors merely tolerated. Goldenseal became the backbone of an entire American school of medicine called the eclectics, trained physicians who studied anatomy and chemistry, but built their pharmacy around plants. In Cincinnati, a gifted pharmacist named John Uri Lloyd spent much of his life refining Goldenseal extracts, and the Eclectic Medical Institute there taught thousands of doctors to use the root for infected wounds, sore throats, and inflamed membranes. The Lloyd brothers catalogued it in their definitive reference on the drugs and medicines of North America in 1884. Goldenseal was respectable enough to earn a place among the era's officially recognized medicines. Picture a country doctor in 1870 mixing a yellow wash to rinse a child's infected eye, reaching for the same root a Cherokee healer had trusted 2 centuries earlier. On the frontier, where a real pharmacy antibiotic was still generations away, this yellow root was about as close as a family could get. And the very thing that made Goldenseal special, that it grew wild and a patient could gather it himself, was about to work against it. That same year, 1908, the American Medical Association asked the Carnegie Foundation to take a hard look at how American doctors were being trained. They handed the job to a man named Abraham Flexner. Flexner was not a physician. He held a classics degree and had run a small preparatory school. Over about a year and a half, he visited all 155 medical schools in the United States and Canada, and in 1910 he published his findings as the Flexner Report. The report crowned one model as the only legitimate one: medicine built on laboratories and standardized, manufactured drugs. It singled out the botanical and eclectic schools for poor laboratories and thin hospital training. On its own, that was just a piece of paper. But then the money arrived. John D. Rockefeller's General Education Board and the Carnegie Foundation began steering enormous grants toward schools that adopted the new model, and away from the ones still teaching plants. By some counts, those foundations poured at least $180 million into reshaping American medicine over the 20 years that followed. State licensing boards quickly fell in line. Think about the incentive for a moment. The new medicine was built around something a company could patent, bottle, and sell. A route that any family could walk into the woods and dig for free was the opposite of a business. You would think the eclectic doctors would have had powerful defenders. They did not. The number of medical schools in the country fell from around 160 in 1904 to 66 by 1935. In 1934, the head of the Eclectic Doctors Association admitted the bind they were in, that they could either be absorbed by the dominant group and lose their identity, or hold on to their independence and slowly fade. Within 5 years, fading is exactly what happened. The schools that taught Goldenseal could not raise the money to meet the new rules, and one by one they closed. In 1939, the last eclectic medical school, the one in Cincinnati, graduated its final class and shut its doors. The tradition that had championed this plant for a century was gone. But this was never only about a few medical schools in Ohio. While the doctors who respected Goldenseal disappeared, the digging in the forest never slowed for a day. If anything, it grew worse. The young supplement industry rediscovered the root and put it back on the shelf, often packaged with echinacea for colds and flu. The wild plants paid the bill. Back in 1905, the country was already pulling somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 pounds of Goldenseal root out of the woods every year, and the plant was visibly thinning even then. Generations later, it had not stopped. A survey by the American Herbal Products Association found that between 1999 and 2010, harvesters were still digging an average of about 63,000 pounds of dried root a year. Think about what that number really means. At roughly 500 roots to a dried pound, that comes to more than 30 million wild plants destroyed every year. And that figure only counts the diggers who bothered to answer the survey. Goldenseal cannot take that kind of pressure. It grows slowly, it lives a long time, and it sets very few seeds, so a picked-over patch can take many years to recover, if it ever recovers at all. Researchers who tracked harvested patches found that pulling the biggest roots, the ones diggers want most, strips out exactly the mature plants a population needs to rebuild. Every easy harvest makes the next one harder. This next part rarely gets told. In 1997, the United States itself backed a proposal to place Goldenseal on Appendix 2 of the International Endangered Species Treaty, known as CCITES, so that today you need a federal permit just to ship it out of the country. The conservation group United Plant Savers lists it as at risk. The Global Red List calls it vulnerable. It is now considered endangered or threatened in states from Connecticut and Vermont to Georgia and Minnesota. And the price has told the same story, climbing from about $18 a pound in the early 1990s to as much as $400 a pound at the retail counter today. The same bright yellow that made it precious is what helps a digger spot the last few plants in the leaf litter. So where does that leave you, out walking an old hardwood forest some morning in spring? Goldenseal is not hard to recognize once you know it. Look in rich, moist shade under the big trees for a low plant with a pair of broad, deeply lobed leaves on a forked, hairy stalk, topped by a single greenish-white flower with no real petals, and later a lone berry that looks like a small red raspberry. Scratch the soil at the base and you will see the giveaway, that knot of root the color of an egg yolk. And here is the part that matters most today. The most useful thing you can do with a wild stand of goldenseal is leave it standing. This plant survived native healers, frontier doctors, and a full century of the supplement trade. But it may not survive being dug up for one more fashionable cold remedy. If you want goldenseal in your life, plant it in your own shade, or buy from the forest farmers who grow it under the trees instead of stripping it from the wild. There are good people doing exactly that, quietly bringing it back. That faint yellow glow under the leaves is the same one the Cherokee followed, the same one that filled the doctor's dispensatories, the same one we very nearly lost for good. It is still out there. Two of the most important medicines of the 20th century came from the same plant. One ended generations of suffering for people with crippling inflammation. The other changed how families were planned across the entire world. Together, they built a fortune worth billions, and the root they came from was dug out of the mud by barefoot farmers paid a few cents a day, who were told it was only good for making soap. So why has almost no one ever heard of the plant that made all of it possible? It gave the world the birth control pill and the drug cortisone. It turned a tangle of jungle vines into nearly 90% of the world's steroid hormones. And the pharmaceutical industry it made rich abandoned it the moment it found something cheaper. This is the story of wild yam, Veracruz, Mexico, 1942. A chemist named Russell Marker is crawling through the dense, humid forests of eastern Mexico, looking for a plant most botanists had barely studied. Marker was not a typical scientist. He had walked away from his own doctorate at the University of Maryland because he refused to take classes he found pointless. He helped invent the octane rating system that still measures gasoline today, and then he walked away from that too. What obsessed him was hormones. In the 1930s, hormones like progesterone were almost impossible to produce. Doctors extracted tiny amounts from the urine of pregnant horses and the organs of slaughtered animals. A single gram could cost as much as $1,000. For a person who needed it, the price was out of reach. Marker had a different idea. He believed he could build human hormones directly from wild plants. In an obscure botany textbook, he found a reference to a Mexican yam the locals called cabeza de negro, and he was convinced its heavy root was full of a compound called diosgenin. So he hired 2 local farmers, paid them to dig up the tubers, and carried them back to a borrowed laboratory. He was right. Using a series of chemical steps the world would later call the Marker degradation, he turned that muddy jungle root into pure, medical-grade progesterone. Not a trace amount. Kilograms. One early batch weighed 3 kilograms, the largest amount ever made at the time, worth roughly $240,000 in 1943. Think about that for a second. A man crawling through a Mexican forest had just produced more of a precious human hormone in one borrowed lab than the entire industry could pull from thousands of gallons of animal urine. Marker took his discovery to Mexico City, found 2 partners in the phone book, and in 1944 they founded a company, They called it Syntex. The first kilo of progesterone sold for $50 a gram, a fraction of the old price, and the orders started pouring in. Then the dispute came. By 1945, Marker had fallen out with his partners over money and walked away from Syntex, refusing to patent his process so that anyone could use it for free. The company he left behind hired new chemists, and that is when the story got bigger than anyone expected. In 1951, a Syntex team took Marker's yam-based hormone and changed one small piece of its structure. The result was a progesterone you could swallow as a pill instead of injecting. They were trying to treat menstrual problems and miscarriage. What they had actually made was the first oral contraceptive, the pill that reshaped the 20th century. The same route also gave the world cortisone, the anti-inflammatory that let people with crippling arthritis walk again. And almost all of it traced back to the jungles of Mexico. By the 1960s, Mexico supplied close to 90% of the world's steroid hormones. Tens of thousands of rural farmers, called barbasqueros, spent their days knee-deep in jungle mud, digging up tubers that could weigh more than they did, then selling them to middlemen who sold them to the laboratories. Almost none of those farmers knew what they were digging. They were routinely told the root was used to make soap. The man pulling a 100-pound tuber out of the ground for a few cents had no way of knowing it would end up as the most influential medicine of his lifetime, sold back to the world at a markup he would never see. You would think someone would have told them. Nobody did. A kilogram of Verbascum paid the digger less than a single peso. By the mid-1970s, more than 2,000 tons of the root were being processed every year, and the men who pulled it from the earth were earning roughly the price of a soda for a full day's work. For a while, this made Mexico the center of the pharmaceutical world. That did not last. In 1975, the Mexican president decided the farmers had been cheated long enough. His government created a state company to raise the diggers' pay and to finally tell them what their root was really worth. For the first time, the barbasqueros learned they had been feeding a global industry. But the moment the people at the bottom asked for a fair share, the industry started looking for the nearest exit. Two things happened at once. The wild yam was being stripped from the jungle faster than it could grow back, vanishing from whole regions by the late 1970s. And corporate chemists had figured out how to make the same hormones from something far cheaper and far easier to control. Soybeans. Cheap, farmable, and not attached to 10,000 jungle farmers asking to be paid. By the end of the 1970s, it was over. The companies switched to soy. The Mexican steroid industry that had supplied the world collapsed within a few years. The farmers who had built it went back to being poor farmers. And the wild yam, the plant that had launched the entire modern hormone industry, was left behind in the jungle, no longer needed. If the story stopped here, it would already be remarkable. It does not stop here. Because while the industry moved on, the name wild yam stayed behind, and a different business grew up around it. Walk into almost any health store today, and you will find creams and pills made from wild yam, sold to women for menopause, for cramps, for balancing their hormones. The promise is simple. This plant became progesterone in a laboratory, so rub it on your skin and your body will do the same thing naturally. It will not. And this is the detail that explains everything. Diosgenin, the active compound in wild yam, can be turned into human hormones, but only in a lab, through the chemical steps Russell Marker spent years working out. Your body cannot perform that conversion. It does not have the chemistry to do it. Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center states it plainly. There is no evidence the human body can turn diosgenin into progesterone. So a wild yam cream that promises natural progesterone is selling you the one thing the plant cannot do on its own. The creams that do contain a working hormone tell on themselves, if you know how to read the label. They list progesterone made in a laboratory, often started from yam or soy, then added back in. The picture of the plant on the front is decoration. The chemistry is still happening where it always happened, in a factory. None of that means the plant is worthless. The American wild yam, the variety that grows in the woods from New England down to Texas, was used for generations as a remedy for cramps and stomach pain. Herbalists called it colic root. Modern testing shows its compounds carry real anti-inflammatory activity, which is what that old reputation was built on. But that is a long way from the miracle on the label. And for someone who has watched a lot of promises come and go, that gap is the point. The most useful thing wild yam can give you today is not a hormone. It is the ability to read a label and know when you are being sold a story. Which brings us back to the men in the jungle, digging up a root they were told was good for making soap. They were closer to the truth than the marketing is. The wild yam never was. It was a magic hormone you could rub on your skin. Its real power was always something it could only become in the hands of a chemist, after a process most people will never see. The plant did something extraordinary for the world. It just never got to keep the credit. And neither did the people who pulled it from the ground. It still grows out there today, in the jungles of Mexico and the woods of America. Heart-shaped leaves climbing over the underbrush, asking for nothing, owed almost everything. If this vault changed how you see the history of modern medicine, do not let this knowledge disappear the way the people who dug this root did. In 2001, a team of psychiatrists in Tehran ran a quiet experiment that should have made global headlines, and somehow never did. They gathered 36 people living with diagnosed anxiety, and they split them into two groups. One group received oxazepam, a prescription tranquilizer from the most profitable family of drugs the 20th century ever produced. The other group received nothing but drops pressed from a wild flower, the kind that climbs along fence posts and roadsides across the American South. 4 weeks later, the researchers compared them. The level of relief was essentially the same, but the people taking the prescription drug had significantly more trouble functioning at work. The people taking the flower did not. A common wildflower had just held its own against a blockbuster, patented sedative. At least that is the headline a careful reader could have written. Because here is the part that should stop you cold. America had already pulled that very same flower off its shelves. Not after the study. 23 years before it. Peru, 1569. Spanish missionaries moving through South America came across a flowering vine unlike anything in Europe. Its bloom was almost architectural, a crown of fine purple filaments circling 5 petals and 5 sepals. To devout eyes, every part of it looked like a piece of the crucifixion. The ring of filaments became the crown of thorns, the 5 petals and 5 sepals, the faithful apostles. So they named it for the Passion of Christ. That is how a plant the native peoples of the Americas had used for generations picked up the name we still use today. Passionflower. What the missionaries did not realize is that this was no exotic rarity. Passiflora incarnata is native to the American Southeast. Early settlers called it the maypop, after the hollow pop the ripe fruit makes underfoot. The Cherokee and other southeastern peoples had steeped the leaves and the vine into a tea to quiet the nerves and ease restless sleep, long before any European wrote a word about it. The first time it showed up in an American medical text was 1787, when a German physician named Johann Schöpf catalogued the healing plants of the young country and noted passionflower being used to calm seizures in the elderly. Around 1840, a Mississippi doctor formally introduced it into medicine as a treatment for nervous anxiety. It looked like a small entry in a small medical journal at the time. It wasn't. By the end of the 1800s, a legitimate school of American physicians had built their practice around plants like this one. They were called the electics, and they were not fringe healers. They had accredited colleges, thick reference books, and thousands of practicing doctors. In 1898, two of their leading figures, Harvey Felter and John Uri Lloyd, documented passionflower as a dependable nervine, a reliable remedy for insomnia, mental worry, and the exhausted, overworked mind. In plain terms, they were prescribing it for exactly what we would now call clinical anxiety and stress. It worked well enough that the medical establishment itself finally took notice. From 1916 to 1936, passionflower was listed in the National Formulary, the definitive reference book American pharmacists used to fill prescriptions. For 20 years, it sat in the same pages as the era's most trusted medicines. A flower from a southern fence line had earned a place in the National Medicine Cabinet. So what was it actually doing in there? The calming compounds in passionflower appear to work on a system in the human brain called GABA. It is the body's own brake pedal, the chemical signal that tells an overactive mind to slow down. And that is the same general brake the modern anxiety drugs reach for. Which brings us right back to that quiet study in Tehran. That trial was published in the Journal of Clinical Pharmacy and Therapeutics, led by a researcher at Tehran University of Medical Sciences. It was small, a pilot study. Just 36 patients, and the scientists were the first to say so. Half took 45 drops of passionflower extract a day. Half took 30 milligrams of oxazepam, a standard benzodiazepine. Neither the patients nor the doctors knew who was getting which. After 4 weeks, there was no measurable difference in how much the anxiety eased. The drug did work a little faster in the first few days, but it also left more people struggling to do their jobs, feeling foggy and slowed down. The flower calmed them without dimming them. The researchers closed their paper by calling for a larger trial. If passionflower had had a wealthy corporate sponsor, that larger trial would have happened many times over. It never really did. And the reason why is the real story of this archive. To understand it, you have to go back to a laboratory in Nutley, New Jersey, in the 1950s. A chemist named Leo Sternbach was working for the Swiss drug company Hoffmann La Roche, and in 1955 he stumbled onto a new kind of molecule almost by accident. It calmed lab animals without knocking them out. Roche put the first one on the market in 1960 under the name Librium. 3 years later came the one that changed everything. Diazepam. Valium. Valium was a genuine advance. It was much harder to overdose on than the heavy barbiturates it replaced, and for a while it looked like the safe answer to a nervous age. The public agreed. From 1969 to 1982, Valium was the single most prescribed drug in the United States. In its peak year, 1978, Roche sold roughly 2.3 billion pills stamped with that little v. 2.3 billion in 1 year. That is the kind of money that builds corporate headquarters and funds 1,000 clinical studies. And here is the asymmetry at the center of the whole story. You can patent a molecule. You cannot patent a flower. Sternbach's compound was owned, protected, and enormously profitable. So Roche could pour money into proving it worked and selling it to every doctor in America. Passionflower was free. It grew in ditches. No corporation could legally own it, which meant no company had any reason to spend a fortune proving what the eclectic physicians had already known for an entire century. That asymmetry came to a head in 1978. The Food and Drug Administration was reviewing the ingredients allowed in over-the-counter sleep aids and sedatives, and it set a simple rule. To stay on the shelf, an ingredient needed fresh, funded evidence submitted on its behalf at the hearings. For a patented billion-dollar blockbuster, that was no obstacle. For Passionflower, there was no one to show up. No manufacturer stood to make a protected fortune from it, so no manufacturer paid the legal and scientific fees to defend it. When the hearings finally ended, Passionflower was quietly removed from American over-the-counter sleep aids. Not because anyone had shown it was dangerous, but simply because no one had been paid to prove it worked. Sit with what that means for a moment. The plant was not pulled for harming people. It was dropped for the lack of a corporate sponsor. The same year Roche sold 2.3 billion patented pills, the older, gentler remedy lost its place in the cabinet for the offense of being unknownable. And the timing turned out to be its own kind of irony. Because in the years that followed, the story of the blockbuster drugs grew more complicated. Doctors and patients slowly learned that the benzodiazepines carried something the early marketing had played down. Tolerance, physical dependence, a withdrawal that could be genuinely hard to come through, and sometimes dangerous. The patented drug that had been sold as the clean, modern answer turned out to have a long shadow of its own. Through all of it, the maypop kept doing what it had always done. It still grows wild across the south, the same purple crown opening on the same roadside vines. People still gather the leaves and flowers, dry them, and steep them into a mild tea at the end of a restless day. The same way the Cherokee did. The same way the old country doctors did. One honest word of caution here, because it matters. If you currently take a prescription sedative, especially a benzodiazepine, do not mix it with anything, and do not change course on your own. Those are drugs you only ever step away from with a doctor walking beside you. This is a piece of history and a humble cup of tea, not a replacement for your medicine. Those Spanish missionaries believed they were looking at a symbol of suffering when they named the Passionflower. 4 centuries later, it turns out the flower was quietly suited to the opposite. To calm. To the kind of ordinary gentle peace an entire tranquilizer empire was built to sell. Sitting in plain sight the whole time, along every southern fence line, asking for nothing, and owned by no one. If this vault changed how you see the wild plants in your own world, don't let this one slip away the way it did the first time. Right now, on a website you have never heard of, someone is selling a small brown bottle of plant extract for the better part of $20. The label promises it will slow heavy bleeding, quiet a nosebleed, ease a punishing period. What the label leaves out is that the plant sealed inside that bottle grows free in the crack of the sidewalk outside your front door, and that a little over 100 years ago, army doctors gathered that very same plant by the armful, on their knees in the mud, because it was the last thing left that could keep a wounded man from bleeding to death. Picture a field dressing station in France, in the winter of 1917. A doctor reaches for the medicine that stops a hemorrhage, and the shelf is bare. The drug he needs is drawn from a fungus that grows on rye, and the war has severed the supply at its source. So he does something no modern hospital would dream of. He sends men out into the ditches to pull up a small green plant with heart-shaped seed pods, a plant every one of them had stepped over since they were children. Within the hour, a liquid pressed from it is slowing the bleeding of the wounded. It worked well enough that armies leaned on it through 2 world wars. And then, the moment the shelves filled back up, medicine quietly set it down and walked away. If it worked, why was it forgotten? It is not rare, and it is not exotic. Botanists call it Capsella bursa-pastoris, a member of the mustard family, and it is one of the most common plants on Earth. You will find it in sidewalk cracks, in gravel driveways, in the tired soil at the edge of a parking lot, carrying tiny white flowers and those flat green pods shaped like the little leather purses shepherds once hung from their belts. That shape is where it got its name. Most people who see it, if they notice it at all, reach for the mower. People have leaned on this plant for a very long time. Archaeologists found its seeds at Çatalhöyük, a Neolithic town in what is now Turkey, buried in soil nearly 8,000 years old. In the 1st century, the Greek physician Dioscorides wrote down a small pouch-shaped plant that stopped bleeding. 1,500 years later, the English herbalist Nicholas Culpeper put it in his herbal and praised it for every kind of bleeding, inward and outward, from a soldier's wound to a common nosebleed. On separate continents, in centuries that never touched, people kept reaching for the same roadside plant for the same reason: to stop blood. That reputation is exactly what carried it into a war. When the Great War began in 1914, European medicine had two dependable tools for a serious hemorrhage. One was ergot, the dark fungus on rye. The other was Goldenseal, an American woodland root sold as hydrastis. Both moved through international trade, and the war cut both off almost overnight. In Britain and in Germany alike, the ergot and the Goldenseal ran dry. So doctors fell back on the plant in the hedgerow. A liquid extract of shepherd's purse, steeped from the fresh plant in boiling water, went straight onto the shelf as a substitute. For centuries, the old herbals had claimed it matched ergot and Goldenseal. Now that claim was being tested on the worst wounds a battlefield could produce. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The plant refused to behave like the drugs it was standing in for. For most of history, when a plant stopped bleeding, chemists had one explanation ready: tannins, the same harsh compounds that dry out your mouth in a cup of strong tea that tanners used to turn raw hide into leather. Tannins pulled tissue tight, and that was the mechanism everyone trusted. But when 19th century researchers went looking for tannins in shepherd's purse, they found almost none. Nowhere near enough to explain what the plant did on an open wound. Whatever was happening was stranger than that, and it came with a flaw that drove pharmacists to distraction. Pick the plant fresh, and it worked. Let it dry in a jar for a single season, and the power was simply gone. At the time, that looked like nothing more than a storage problem. It was the whole story in miniature. Because there was a second explanation, one that a handful of investigators raised and could never quite kill. Shepherd's purse is often coated in a fine white mildew, a fungus that films across its leaves and stems and leaves behind a faint, fishy smell. One researcher, a pharmacognosist named Steinmetz, floated an unsettling idea. What if a real share of the plant's blood-stopping fame never belonged to the plant at all, but to that mildew growing on it? If he was even partly right, then the wild plant that saved men in a muddy field owed some of its power to a fungus that turned up one summer and vanished the next, which would finally explain the thing no one else could. Why two handfuls of the same plant, pulled from two different ditches, could act like two completely different medicines? Most people never heard that part. But the doctors of the 1930s were living inside it, and they had run out of patience. When the Second World War arrived, Britain hit the same wall all over again. German occupation of Europe and submarines in the shipping lanes strangled the drug supply by the early 1940s, and this time the country got organized about it. In 1941, the Ministry of Health set up a Vegetable Drugs Committee at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, guided by the Medical Research Council. More than 70 county herb committees formed across Britain, most of them run by the women of the Women's Institute and the Scottish Women's Rural Institutes. Grandmothers, school teachers, Boy Scouts and Girl Guides walked the hedgerows collecting the medicines the country could no longer buy. A bleeding stopper growing in every lane in England was exactly what they were sent to gather. But at the very moment those women were filling their baskets, a discovery in a laboratory was quietly making the whole effort unnecessary. 6 years earlier, in 1935, 2 men in England, a chemist named Harold Ward Dudley and an obstetrician named John Chassar Moir, had finally cracked open the rye fungus and drawn out the single pure compound that did the work. They named it ergometrine. For the first time, a doctor could hold in his hand the exact thing that stopped a hemorrhage. Not a fungus, not a plant brew of unknown strength, but a measured dose that behaved the same way every single time. That was the one thing the plant could never offer. Hand a doctor shepherd's purse, and he had no way of knowing whether this batch was strong or weak, fresh or spent, mildewed or clean. Hand him ergometrine, and he could measure out 0.5 milligram and know, to the letter, what would happen next. In a hospital, the reliable thing wins. Every time. And here the story turns away from the one you might be expecting. Moir could have patented ergometrine and grown rich from it. He refused. He insisted the method be published in full, free for any company on earth to manufacture. Nobody locked the knowledge in a vault. There was simply a dependable drug that saved a staggering number of mothers from bleeding to death after childbirth, and beside it, a roadside plant that worked sometimes in a way no one could promise. In those same years, a Danish scientist, Henrik Dam, identified vitamin K, the very nutrient the body uses to form a clot, and later won a Nobel Prize for it. One more exact, dependable tool for the job the plant had always done by luck. You would think someone would have kept studying the plant anyway, if only to understand it. Almost no one did. It was free, it could not be patented, and there was no fortune waiting at the end of the research. So it fell out of the medical books and back into the ditches it came from, and the world stopped seeing it. It never actually left, of course. If you want to find it, wait for early spring and look along any path or fence line for a low rosette of jagged, dandelion-like leaves, then a thin stalk of small, white flowers, and beneath them those flat, heart-shaped pods climbing the stem like beads on a string. The young leaves are good to eat, peppery, closer to arugula than to lettuce, and cooks in Korea, Japan, and China have gathered them for generations. One honest caution, and it matters. Because this plant can nudge the muscles of the womb, it is one to leave well alone during pregnancy. Learn its shape once, and you will never be able to unsee it. And here is where it all comes back around. In the last 20 years, researchers have started paying attention again. In 2011, Europe's Herbal Medicines Committee went back through the old records and issued a formal monograph recognizing shepherd's purse as a traditional remedy for heavy menstrual bleeding. In 2018, a clinical trial reported that it measurably reduced heavy menstrual flow in the women who took it. And a wide-ranging review published in 2024 pulled the modern findings together in one place, mapping not only the bleeding effects the old herbalists swore by, but anti-inflammatory and antibacterial activity that chemists are still working through. The pieces inside it, the flavonoids, the peptides, the potassium salts, and a genuine dose of that same vitamin K are being named at last, one at a time. Which brings us back to that small brown bottle for sale online, pressed from a plant standing free at the end of your road. Shepherd's purse was never a miracle, and it was never a secret anyone stole from you. Its story is quieter and stranger than that. It worked just well enough to carry armies through 2 wars, and just unreliably enough that the day science built something steadier, the world let it slip through its fingers. That is what tends to happen to the things nature gives away for free. They work, but they cannot be measured, and they cannot be owned, so they get set down and forgotten, while the ditch keeps growing them anyway. Those little heart-shaped purses have been riding that stem for 8,000 years. Most people will walk straight past them tomorrow morning. You will not. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the plants the record left behind and the honest reasons they were let go, subscribe to Nature's Lost Vault. The next vault opens soon.